Hello friends, and welcome back to Dungeon Design in Zelda. Last time we examined Catfish's Maw, which was a pretty good navigation-focused dungeon that rewarded us with the hookshot, so it gets points just for that. Today, we're looking at the Face Shrine, which is a pivotal moment in the game's narrative, since after this point, nothing on Koholint Island will be the same. So for the first time here, while examining Link's Awakening, I'm going to offer a little spoiler warning. This video will be here, don't worry. You can save it to your watch later list and come back later, or be spoiled. That is up to you. I know it seems a little silly that I'm issuing a spoiler warning for a 30-year-old game, but you've been warned regardless. So let's stop wasting time and hop right into things. Just north of Animal Village is a little path that we've actually been able to access for quite some time, but it's just before the 6th dungeon that this trek becomes mandatory. While taking this path, the owl will tell us that there are 2 nearby shrines, one to the north and one to the south. The northern one is the dungeon, but the entrance is locked. The key is of course found in the shrine to the south, which sits among the ancient ruins. You'll want to come equipped with the bow if you haven't already bought it from the shop in order to make quick work of the many Armos slumbering here. Just a quick note here, exploring these ruins, while brief, is pretty fun, but I think this is one of those cases where the reduced visibility of the Game Boy original actually plays nicely into the design. With such a limited field of view, you often will find forks in the road with no real way of actually knowing which is the correct path until you just try one. While I'm not usually a fan of guesswork, it's mostly unintrusive, and taking a path towards a dead end will usually still gain you a glimpse towards the road ahead. It also ends up making the whole area feel much larger than it really is. This is one of those moments where the devs not only took technical limitations into account, but designed the space with those limitations in mind. While the remake's seamless scrolling is usually to the game's benefit, especially when you have such large open spaces, it actually ends up undermining the tone of this area just a little bit. When you can see so much of the path ahead, you don't have to figure out how to navigate the space here. This is one of the only times in the game where this is an issue for me personally, but I do find it interesting to see where and when that seamless scrolling gets integrated into the remake, because there are times in dungeons where they choose not to do it, where I think it would be a benefit, and then there are times like out here in the ruins where they do, despite the area clearly having been designed with a limited field of view in mind. Eventually, we'll reach the South Face Shrine. A change I like is that in the remake they replace these nondescript gargoyle-esque statues, which were taken right from A Link to the Past's Eastern Palace I might add, with statues of the Armos Knight, which is far more fitting since that's who we'll be fighting inside. Yep, a little pre-dungeon boss fight. If you played A Link to the Past, this guy will feel pretty familiar to you, though it's just a single one instead of 6. He will attempt to jump on you, so you've got to avoid that and then strike back, with arrows being the most effective weapon against him. This fight is pretty decent, and while not overwhelmingly so, it's nice to have such an aggressive boss, especially considering how few of them so far have been any real threat. And it's also neat that he will actually take battle damage. That's a nice touch. Once he's defeated, he'll drop the face key, so we can go unlock the dungeon. But first, there's something in the back room, a stone relief, which reads as follows. To the finder, the Isle of Koholint is but an illusion. Human, monster, sea, sky, a scene on the lid of a sleeper's eye. Awake the dreamer, and Koholint will vanish, much like a bubble on a needle. Castaway, you should know the truth. This is followed by Link's only shown line of dialogue in the game. What? Illusion. The owl outside will say nobody is really sure if this is the truth. No one except the windfish, urging us to continue on our quest. Now, I've spent a lot more time on this pre-dungeon section than usual, but there's a reason for that. Put simply, sitting with this knowledge, experiencing this revelation, will directly play into the dungeon experience, and I really feel that that is important. So we may as well get into it. With the face key in hand, we can cross through this stone maze and underground tunnel, and using the face key, we can head into the dungeon. This is the one I was most looking forward to revisiting. Welcome to the Face Shrine. Oh yeah, look at that. It's a little face. And so is he. So I wouldn't really be doing this dungeon justice if we didn't address the elephant in the room. And I don't mean these statues. I mean the music. Starting with the original Game Boy version. The song is a direct parallel to the South Face Shrine theme that we heard before the dungeon, but with a suitably different tone. The South version was slow and mysterious, a fitting piece, considering it was there that we learned the truth of Koholint Island. Of course, this theme got a fantastic update in the remake, adding this gut-punching string section. Now, in the actual Face Shrine dungeon, the theme drops the slow, mysterious vibe and replaces it with a sense of dread. We know the truth, and now we have to sit with it. The track wonderfully plays with the levels fading in and out. The best way I can describe the feeling here is like this track is the musical representation of having a pit in your stomach and having to push on anyways, even if you're not 100% sure that what you're doing is right. It's an incredible piece of dungeon music. If you ask me, the best one in the game. And that's on the Game Boy. But the remake's version is nothing short of a masterpiece. Using primarily string, an entirely new rendition of the theme takes shape, one that fully embraces that sense of questioning, of dread. And then, nearly a minute into the track, the original Game Boy version kicks in, playing unaltered. Not just elements of the theme with new instrumentation, both versions play side by side, uninterrupted for nearly a full minute. It is not hyperbole or figure of speech when I say that this dungeon theme gives me goosebumps. It is the perfect musical accompaniment to the narrative here. That feeling of having learned a terrible truth and being left to stew in it. This is the track that made me have to look up the music credits for the remake, because I needed to know who to thank. Ryo Nagamatsu is credited with music and arrangements, and holy crap, Nintendo, give this man a raise! What an incredible body of work. But bringing this back to Link's Awakening, he truly did an incredible job of taking this game's soundtrack and breathing new life into it, and Face Shrine might be his magnum opus. Thank you, Mr. Nagamatsu. Perhaps this contradicts statements that I've made in the past, but the remake's version of this theme might not just be the best dungeon music in the game, it's among the best dungeon music in the entire Zelda series. If it's not the best, it is certainly up there, putting up a good fight with the likes of the Forest Temple. As much as I could go on and on praising this track, I will always be the first to admit that music theory is a weak spot of mine. I do not know the technicalities of how these artists bring these pieces of music together. I can only tell you how it makes me feel listening to it. So sometimes you just need to bring in the experts. So please welcome Zelda Music Theory to the channel.
This is the best part of the video. No cap. The Face Shrine has a theme that perfectly suits its context within the game. Link has just learned a truth that will change his perspective irreversibly. And suddenly, we find for the first time in the game, a dungeon theme missing a certain motif. Anyone remember this? Or this? Or this? It turns out this 1, 2, 3, 7 line occurs in every single cave and dungeon theme in the game. Every theme, that is, except one. See, Link just left the Southern Face Shrine, where he learns the truth about waking the Windfish, and the shrine theme contains this quote. But the true meaning of this motif is hidden a bit deeper. We hear this theme throughout the game. And you begin to realize that the theme being quoted is actually the Ballad of the Windfish. And then you start to hear it everywhere. Da-da-da-dum, da-da-da-dum. It's almost as if this theme becomes the villain of the game, the song that can annihilate the entire island population, and Link doesn't want to wake up. Wow, some of us have been sleeping on this theme. Am I right? Okay, why did I spend so much time on this? The Face Shrine is the first theme in the game where the Ballad of the Windfish motif is blatantly absent. Perhaps to make it even more obvious, they used an identical theme to the Southern Face Shrine and just removed Ballad of the Windfish, the one quote we expected to be there. It's like his subconscious won't let him believe the lie any longer. There's no going back. And to symbolize this, they integrated one theme into every component of the soundtrack, then ripped it away from the Face Shrine theme to leave us with this. It kind of takes on a Beethoven Moonlight Sonata kind of feel. You get the same chord progression, same tonicization of the relative major, diminished arpeggios. That's probably the single piece that most heavily influenced the Face Shrine theme. Dancing back and forth between the 1 minor and the 6 major chord blurs the line between happy and sad. And creates this very bittersweet tone. Fun fact, Gerudo Valley uses the same chord progression. Let's switch versions. Face Shrine might be the most moving piece in the entire remake's soundtrack. This arrangement takes on a very Samuel Barber adagio for strings instrumentation. And that theme was used in the movie Platoon, which is extremely emotional. It just shows you the weight of emotion they're going for here. Platoon, not Splatoon. The music utilizes ambiguity as a tool to symbolize Link's lack of understanding about the island and the truth about the Windfish. We are frequently caught between major and minor chords and even keys. I think Link himself isn't sure how he feels. Phase Shrine is divided into 3 sections. The first 8 measures, the second 8 measures, and the final 8 measures. The piece starts off in C minor. We get 3 flats, which could be E flat major or C minor, but this B natural here, which is borrowed from C major, really pulls us back into C minor, and it keeps appearing. That raised 7 or leading tone is almost like Link just can't forget what he's just heard. It's like he wants to evolve into major, but he just can't, and it ends up looping right back into minor where he started. The second section, it starts off similarly, but this time he does successfully end in major. You'll notice now instead of B naturals, we start getting B flats. It takes a second time through for Link to forget what he's heard and keep this illusion going. Then the last 8 measures lead where we know we must go. Ending on a 5-7 flat 9 chord, we get a very dark, strong return back to the harsh reality of the truth. Ultimately, it's unavoidable. The truth is going to prevail, and Link is going to have to face the reality of waking the Windfish. He's going to have to face reality. Subscribe for more dad jokes. Back to you, Captain.
Thank you so much for joining on this video and providing your insights into this wonderful piece of music. Thank you so much, man. And for everybody watching, there's a link in the description to his channel. Please make sure to go check it out for some excellent music analysis. In terms of architecture and aesthetics, we have a far less naturalistic approach this time around. Like Key Cavern, the structure is entirely man-made. In both versions, the walls use this uncanny pink stone brick with stone floor tiles and ornate statues all over the place. It's a visually distinct and at times even pleasant looking dungeon, if not a bit eerie, though the remake puts in a lot of effort to further distinguish it from Key Cavern, adding in lots of details like these little gold flourishes as accents, as well as more distinct floor tiles. Plus, the entire place feels more dynamically lit in this version, which is to be expected. You can only do so much with the lighting in a Game Boy game, but they really use it effectively to play into that eerie atmosphere here in the remake. I think it looks great. The dungeon progression and layout alike can be broken into 2 sections, those being the western and eastern halves respectively, both being in some ways like their own independent tangled knots to work through, each with no discernible central room. Just like Catfish's Maw, the western side needs to be tackled first, with us having to work through it to find the map, compass, and dungeon item. Then the eastern half second, in which we need to use the item to solve puzzles, find the boss key, and figure out how to reach the boss itself. Overall, I'd say a solid dungeon experience, though perhaps to a lesser extent than Angler's Tunnel did. The Face Shrine spends a fair amount of time letting us see glimpses of other parts of the dungeon and employs the old treasure chest tease, adding to that overall sense of satisfaction as we pick away at it and figure out how to access each area. These stone elephant statues are used as a pretty simple item gate in many rooms, with the level 2 power bracelet being our dungeon item. Once we have said item, then we can pick up and throw these statues, which will allow us to open new paths and access areas we could usually see but not yet reach. While I would say that it is well implemented here, the level design is all good, I do think just having even heavier things and an upgrade of the same item we already found elsewhere is a bit less interesting as an item gate style of progression, especially after the flippers and hookshot, which both granted new forms of mobility. This item is basically just a rehash, though I will say that the sound design of these statues breaking is really weirdly satisfying in the Game Boy version. There's a real weight behind it. Speaking of the dungeon item, I think I would have preferred if they placed it a little deeper into the dungeon. It's found in this room, and on a first-time playthrough, if you're working through this first half of the dungeon, it can be a real task to find it, and that's good. The dungeon lets you cover a lot of ground and hit dead ends in this massive explorable space, which is good. The drawback is that once you know where it is really easy to grab very early on, which means that on subsequent playthroughs, the exploration part of the dungeon gets severely undermined. Or perhaps an even worse risk is that because it's so readily accessible, there's a chance you could just stumble upon it very early by accident, by way of just happening to choose the correct one of multiple branching paths. I know that to a certain extent, having knowledge of a dungeon's layout and puzzles ahead of time will make the dungeon experience easier. That's a given. But in this particular case, because of how close to the entrance it is placed, it might be just a little too much easier. Playing through Angler's Tunnel or Catfish's Maw with prior knowledge doesn't make it any less of a task to actually get those dungeon items, but the benefit of that knowledge is really felt here. But on a first-time playthrough without that prior knowledge, it can be a real challenge, though something that will help with that, at least in the original version, is this hint that the owl statue will offer once you have the stone beak. It tells you to enter the space where the eyes have walls, which is a clear reference to the map being shaped like a face. On said map, the eyes are empty spaces, but there are hidden rooms there, not unlike level 9 of the original Legend of Zelda on NES. So that's a pretty well-worded hint that will steer us towards the item, if we manage to explore far enough to find the beak and those various dead ends. However, this is something the remake sort of messes up. In most cases, I greatly prefer the more detailed maps of the remake, especially the ability to leave pins, because a lot of dungeon rooms are of uniform size, so often those added details help to make landmarks stand out better. However, the remake also fills in those eyes of the map to show the rooms there, which means the hint about the eyes having walls no longer makes sense. These sorts of hidden rooms in the original are omitted intentionally, so it was a deliberately made puzzle that played into the dungeon shape. And it was one of the few times where the dungeon shape wasn't just unintrusive, but actually was a benefit. So I'm really not sure why they chose to do this. But either way, the added details of the map and ability to leave pins to note connecting stairways and passages does somewhat offset this and make the navigation smoother overall. So it's a double-edged sword, if you ask me. The overall experience is improved, but at the cost of a neat little moment. I mean, they didn't even change or reword the statue's hint. Anyways, once we have everything collected from the western half of the dungeon, we can move on to the eastern half, which has some very interesting puzzles, such as this infinitely looping set of rooms that adds some extra surrealism to the mix, and a couple of mid-bosses. The first one is this guy, sometimes called Rover, sometimes called Smasher, depending on the source. They will lob this heavy orb at you, and you essentially have to grab it and throw it back at them to deal damage. This is one of those fights that's a little bit funny, the way he panics when you grab it. It's a decent mid-boss. We'll also re-encounter a pair of Dodongo snakes, making a return from Key Cavern, though this time in a far more varied arena with some pitfalls in the mix. Aside from these battles, the main objective of this second half is getting the boss key, which first requires a small key to access. Depending on the route you take to get it, however, it can lead to doing an extra lap through this portion of the dungeon, since the small key is down in this lower section with no way to get back up to the balcony if you jumped down from there, aside from backtracking to the start of the loop. It's not an extremely long trip, but it can be a nuisance to retread all of this ground immediately after having just done it. Something I've neglected to mention as well is the way the dungeon makes use of the red and blue gem switches and barriers, which the game first introduced to us way back in Bottle Grotto. I love these things, and Face Shrine makes a very good use of them, having certain paths or even just portions of some rooms blocked off by them, and even using them to jump on at one point to reach these stairs. There's 6 of these gem switches to toggle the barriers spread out throughout the dungeon, and and in some cases the act of activating them needs to be delayed so that you can pass by the barrier first. So they managed to use this as both an obstacle for individual rooms as well as part of a larger multi-room puzzle for navigating the dungeon as a larger whole. Now that's some clever design. Though something I'm a little less enthusiastic about is the dungeon's use of underground passageways, just as was the case in Catfish's Maw. This time there's only 3 of them. 2 of them are essentially extensions of the same route, and the first one, which leads towards the dungeon item, is a simple loop in the path that pretty well never has to be revisited once you've gone through it to get said item, much like the path towards the boss key in Angler's Tunnel. So it doesn't feel as bad to me here as in Catfish's Maw. It's a little less disjointed, but it does still have the effect of muddying up the navigation in a way that I'm not fond of. Of course, the remake's ability to add pins to the map helps in a big way, but in the original, you're pretty well going to have to commit this stuff to memory, or take notes while you go. If dungeon navigation isn't your strong suit, then I can see having to make this trip for the boss key and then having to take a second trip towards the boss door itself being quite the endeavor. I'll clarify. This is only a small amount of time spent in the dungeon going through here. So while the use of these passageways doesn't really do it for me, the other 90% of the time spent navigating this dungeon is really great. There's plenty of explorable space, forks in the road with obstacles and mechanisms to work with, all good stuff. So with all of that said and done, once we've smashed open this chest and gotten the boss key, which is a puzzle that is a little too obvious, we can trek through this passageway and confront the dungeon boss. Entering the room, the boss will appear within the floor itself, taunting us. This is Facade. And yes, he is a weird disembodied face. But hey, we're leaning more and more into surrealism here. And this is when I'd like to shine a light on something which I haven't really addressed yet, outside of some transitional edits. While I ubiquitously use terms like boss key and dungeon boss, as is usually the term in the Zelda series, that isn't what Link's Awakening, the game itself, actually calls these guys. He isn't just the dungeon boss, he is a nightmare, and not in the figurative or metaphorical sense. Recall what we've learned, what knowledge we've been sitting with as we made our way through this dungeon, that the island itself is a dream. So fittingly, the monsters that we are battling within are nightmares. And so leaning into the surrealism here doesn't just make sense, it adds to the danger of it all. This is one of those cases in which the narrative and gameplay go hand in hand. Facade attacks you by flinging floor tiles and pots at you, and making random pitfalls appear in the floor below you, phasing in and out of existence as he does. Though in the original, he only seems to appear in the center of the room, while in the remake, he actually moves around a fair bit. In order to deal damage, you need to explode his face with bombs, and that's it. That said, this is one of those cases where there isn't much to indicate his weakness. He'll even quip about that, so it's a matter of just trying things out to see what attacks work. Once you know, though, he isn't too tough to take down. His appearance either way is neat, but I do think that overall I prefer the more dynamic battle of the remake, just for that extra spatial awareness and timing required with your bombs. And once he's defeated, he'll confirm the worst for us. Before perishing, he'll interject. If the windfish wakes up, everything on this island will be gone forever. And I do mean everything. Herein lies the quandary. Are these nightmares evil? Are we doing the right thing by killing them? They do not seem to be attempting world domination. The owl at the beginning of the game mentions that they only began to act hostile in direct response to Link's presence. At the very notion that someone might wake the windfish, these nightmares are fighting to survive. This dialogue is a plea. It's not just them that will cease to be, it is everything. Everyone. Surely Link could let the windfish sleep, right? Gaholand isn't so bad of a place for Link to retire, right? Are we doing the right thing? To quote my friend Nehru, it's tough to feel good about killing a boss who tells you that they don't want to die. But we have to awaken the windfish, or we'll never be able to leave the island. But if we continue on this trajectory, we are dooming not just these nightmares, but even our friends. Once he's defeated, we'll get our heart container as usual, and we'll find the coral triangle, the sixth instrument of the siren needed to awaken the windfish. So overall, from a strictly level design standpoint, Face Shrine is a pretty good, but not mind-blowingly amazing dungeon on its own. There's a few more notes I have though. These little knight chess piece puzzles are kind of neat, and again one of those things that I think is enhanced in the remake, while still using the same core concept. In the original, you just have to figure out which direction to throw them so that they'll land upright. But in the remake, they instead have designated tiles to be thrown onto, and they move like a knight in chess, so you have to line yourself up accordingly. That's neat. The remake does remove or trim a few redundancies and tedious moments. For example, in the original, the Dodongo snakes will actually respawn if you stray too far, so I ended up having to fight them twice, since I had to take a second lap through this path. In the remake, they'll stay dead. There's also a room in which the doors will lock and you'll be attacked by these spinning floor tiles. In the original, the doors will lock every time, meaning you'll have to just sit through and wait it out if you end up wandering into this room more than once. While in the remake, the floor tiles will respawn, but the doors will not re-lock after the first time, so you can just run through here on subsequent visits. But not everything the remake does is an improvement. The eye room puzzle I mentioned earlier, which the owl statue hints at, makes no sense with the map's extra details filling in those rooms. And that's really too bad because it undermines what was a cool little aha moment. Still, with enough exploration, you should be able to still figure out the dungeon. I just wish they'd either left those rooms blank on the map or changed the phrasing of the hint to actually make sense. Sort of like they did in the color dungeon with these rotating switch puzzles. Though an extremely minor point, I think the looping room puzzle hits a little better in the original version as well. The actual loops are a little more seamless for some reason, while in the remake they add a fade to black at the point where the rooms loop. It is extremely minor, but I think it undercuts the surreal vibe of it. Like, imagine if the infinite stairs in Mario 64 for some reason had this random fade to black at the top instead of this memorable moment where it goes on seemingly forever. Also, there's this one stairway that takes you outside the dungeon briefly for a secret. I just always think it's neat when we get to pop outside the dungeon somewhere for a little moment. I didn't really know where else to include it in the script. It's not a huge moment, but I just think it's neat. All of that said, while the level design itself would leave Face Shrine as simply a very good but not excellent dungeon, the experience overall is greatly enhanced by the music and narrative. I remember the first time I played this dungeon, I swear I had that sinking feeling the entire time just from the context of this dungeon and where it is placed during the game's story. I think it's brilliant that they give you this revelation before the dungeon and just let you stew in it. As strange as it sounds, playing through this place with that pit in my stomach is kind of unforgettable. The remake really bolsters this in many ways by leaning into that eerie, surreal atmosphere, and most notably, by hitting us with that music. What a masterpiece. So, combining the good level design with the context that this dungeon sits in the center of, and assigning it one of the most brilliant pieces of music in the series, and you end up elevating this from just a very good dungeon to an exceptional one. Thank you so much for watching. Special thanks first goes out to Zelda Music Theory for joining me on this video. Please do go check out his channel. There's links in the description. And special thanks goes out to my channel members here on YouTube, as well as my supporters on Patreon. So thank you to Greymage, Brenda, Tetra, Justin, Midnight Naomi, Bunny, Stefan, Avery, and their ATHDs, as well as all of the folks whose names you're seeing on screen right now. You guys are awesome. Thank you all so much for watching, and I hope you have a lovely rest of your day. Bye-bye.
This one I had a hard time finding, except for through SoundCloud. So let's see if that's on YouTube.
I've got this dream, and you're all in it.
Let's hear it.
Oh, that's fitting for Link's Awakening. Oh my gosh. I've got this dream and you're all in it. Oh my goodness. I almost didn't catch that. Okay, that's creepy.